My name is Ryan Katzrozine. I'm an assistant professor at the School of Political Studies here at the University of Ottawa. I'm really pleased to welcome you to a really special opportunity, a special panel. We have four distinguished speakers in the field of international political economy who I will introduce shortly. I am one of the co-organizers of the International Political Economy Network, IPEN here, which is based out of the Center for International Policy Studies, CIPS, and along with me, Randy and Jackie, who I'll introduce shortly, and Chris Huggins, are co-organizers. So you can thank these panelists also for helping to put together this event. We had for those who don't know, we had a fantastic event last night with Craig Murphy at Carleton University. It was part of the IPEN effort to sort of expand territorially to the downriver or upriver, as
Who told me that was part of it? Oh my gosh.
It was an excellent talk, and we thought since we have we have Craig captive for another day, we thought we'd hold a round table and sort of get into a bit more of a discussion, not just with our panelists, but with you guys as well. So that's really the focus of today: create dialogue, discussion, debate. And talk about some of these important themes. So, regarding the return of illiberalism, or we will question that, the return of illiberalism within the global political economy. So, I just want to say quickly that before I introduce our panelists, we do have another event. IPEN is hosting another event next week. I'll pass this around. It's featuring Sean Burgess, who's also at Carleton at the moment. And he will be talking about the emergence of emerging power approach to IPE in using Brazil as a case study. So if you don't mind passing that on. And that will be next week here in this room as well. So I just wanted to give one final quick note. As some of you may have seen on the notice, we had Suzanne Soderberg. She had to unfortunately send her regrets due to a family issue. But while we're sorry to miss her, we are elated to have Juliet University in her stead. Okay, so I'm going to introduce our somewhat unique format for today, and then introduce the speakers, and then we'll have at it. Okay. So, what we're going to try to do, what I've asked the speakers to do, is keep their comments as short as possible, and we kind of haggled out what short means in this context, but we decided on somewhere between 6 to 8 minutes, okay? And so they are all approaching this theme of whether or not the global political economy has seen a return to illiberalism and how this sort of will manifest in the near-term future and what this implies for IPE research going forward. And they're all tackling this from their own sort of frameworks of research that they, and their expertise. So we have, each panelist will speak for around 6 to 8 minutes. I will cut them off at 8 minutes. I'm going to be fairly authoritarian in that regard. And then there's another panelist who will just take 30 seconds, 1 minute to reflect, respond to anything that sort of piqued their interest, if they would like, on the previous speaker. So there's a sort of an order here, and we have an arranged, respondent, a 30-second respondent, and then I will also possibly, if there's time, turn it over to see if there's a quick, one quick response question from the audience. Maybe it can be a comment to, put on the table for discussion later on, and then we'll move to the next panelist. Okay. So, without further ado, I guess I'll introduce our speakers. So, I won't do quite the same justice that Randy gave his exceptional introduction to Craig yesterday. But we have four distinguished speakers, and I think it's important to share some of their contributions and accomplishments. So Craig Murphy is the Betty Freyhoff Johnson 44 Professor of Political Science at Wellesley College. He's published extensively on U.S. policy toward the developing world, economic debates within the UN, the UNDP, the International Organization for Standardization, and the coevolution of industrial capitalism and international institutions. His current project with Joanne Yates at MIT focuses on private international regulatory standard setting So that includes the production of things like environmental and social responsibility standards. And maybe you'll touch on this and we'll see.
Maybe.
Professor Murphy has served as the president of the International Studies Association, as the chair of the Academic Council on the UN System, and as a co-founding editor of the Council's award-winning journal Global Governance, which you may be familiar with. He's worked on the UN staff, he's held visiting appointments at Brown, at Harvard, at Johns Hopkins, at Wesleyan, and has been a fellow of the Radcliffe Institute of Advanced Study, and a visiting scholar at Stanford Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences. And since 2010, he's been helping create an innovative doctoral program in global governance and human security at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. Juliet Johnson, on the far side of the table, is McGill Director of the Jean Monnet Center Montreal, a bilingual center of European Union studies jointly founded by the McGill University and the Université de Montréal. Her research focuses on the politics of money and identity, particularly in post-communist Europe, and she is the author of many books and other contributions to IPE, including recently Priests of Prosperity, How Central Bankers Transformed the Post-Communist World. And there was an excellent talk delivered along those lines as part of an IPEN talk in recent years, which I thoroughly enjoyed. For many years, she was editor-in-chief and co-editor of Right, Review of International Political Economy, a leading journal in the field, and this will be a common theme with our other panelists. And she currently serves on that International Advisory Board. She's a member of PONAR's Eurasia and has been an advisory council member for the Kennan Institute of the Woodrow Wilson Institute, International Center for Scholars. At McGill, she has served as an associate dean for the Faculty of Arts and an elected member of the McGill University Board of Governors, and she has won the faculty's N. Noel Fieldhouse Award for Distinguished Teaching. Randy Germain, to her right, has an extensive background in IP based at numerous universities. So before joining the faculty at Carleton in 2003, he taught at McMaster. He taught at the University of Sheffield, the University of Newcastle upon Tyne, and the University of Wales, Aberystwyth. He has convened the International Political Economy Group of the British International Studies Association and co-edited the Routledge Ripe Series in Global Political Economy. He has served as the chair of the Department of Political Studies at Carleton, and he is also on the advisory board of RIPE, and as well as the Review of International Studies. And as a heads up, he is a former professor of mine, and he once semi-jokingly called me Commie Pinko in front of all my colleagues.
Yeah.
And our own, finally, don't forget these things, man. Okay, our own Jackie Best is a full professor here at the School of Political Studies, and she has also written widely about the history of international financial governance in the 20th century and the changing practices of international organizations like the IMF and the World Bank, and the role of risk and ambiguity and vulnerability in global politics. And her most recent books have dealt with this central problem of failure in global governance and the historical role of ambiguity. And as you might expect, she is also involved with RIPE. She is an editor for the journal, and as I mentioned earlier, she helps me coordinate this network. So, okay. All right, without further ado, we're going to dive into our first panelist, and that will be Craig Murphy, and he's having himself.
Okay, thank you. I always loved coming to Ottawa, which is a place I've known about since I was a child. My father was a premature anti-fascist who came up from Albany, New York, his hometown, to Ottawa in early 1940 to join in the Royal Canadian Air Force. And you weren't supposed to do that because he was American. We didn't think that war was a good war yet. So there's a fondness for Ottawa because of that. And what my basic remark is going to use a phrase that my father says he learned as a very important Canadian phrase in the Royal Canadian Air Force. So I think that the thing that we've learned from this move to the right, which I think actually has existed, is that we don't have a really good way of understanding how coherent and effective systems of global governance can arise in the absence of a hegemonic power. And we need to figure that out, because if we can't figure it out, we're going to be up shit creek without a paddle, which is that phrase that apparently is widely used, widely used in the Royal Canadian Air Force. So that's the thing. It's a really old sort of thing to say. We know lots of things about how maybe international cooperation exists without hegemony if it's already started. We know how it starts with hegemonic powers. There's slightly different ways. If you agree with Bob Cox, then you know the correct way. If you think some other things, then you know the incorrect way. But we don't know how to do it without a hegemonic power. So the rest of my remarks are all taken from Dick Falk, who says relatively recently almost exactly the same thing, although probably in better words. First off, Falk says it's very important for all of us to not think that the problem is just a problem about Trump. And it's not just a problem about right-wing governments around the world. He does say that what we see with Donald Trump is a sign of a capture by a small set of capitalists and state interests of the state in the United States. And he does say it's an example of a worldwide turn toward, and he uses a better phrase, as chauvinistic and mean-spirited forms of autocratic nationalism. Sounds very nice. But he goes on, and this I'll elaborate a bit on it. He says, you know, the real problem is that George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton were confronted with a situation which, as an old man as he is, he's a lot older than I am, so it's nice to be able to talk about people who are older than me. But he says, as an old man like he felt that George Bush and Bill Clinton had the chance at that moment to reestablish the UN system and the forms of global governance based on their original principles, which were Roosevelt's four freedoms. We're going to create a world free from want, free from fear, with freedom of expression, freedom of religion. And they decided not to do that. They decided to create a world based on market democracy. And now I will defer from Richard Falk to Erskine Childers, who said, if I might ask in a plain Irish way, what in the name of God is market democracy? 30 years ago, the phrase would have been strongly challenged as the intellectual rubbish that it is, or as the insidious, undemocratic trickery that it also is. So we didn't get the Falk's ideas, we didn't get the chance, the opportunity for this hegemonic power to actually do something that looks like the four freedoms, and instead we got something else. But then there's an argument behind that, where he says that those administrations, the Clinton administrations and the Clinton administration and the Bush administrations, were aware that to sustain any government in office in the United States at that point, you actually had to create a coalition between Wall Street and some minimum group of voters so that democratic things looked like that they were covered. And they had slightly different ways of getting the coalition between Wall Street and the different group of voters. But the problem was something that happened in the American political system, that you needed that particular coalition to work things through. The Bush-Clinton agenda was obviously small or petty compared to Roosevelt's. Market democracy is a rather crazy thing. And it refused to really address any of the fundamental emerging issues that are a global issue. Concerns like ecological sustainability, militarism, durable inequalities of one sort or another. This again, as Falk has said, it was already clear by the year 2000 that the United States had become what Jimmy Carter calls an oligarchic republic rather than a democratic republic. The decision by the Supreme Court in Bush versus Gore was essentially a decision that said, from now on, we're going to make sure that the oligarch things work rather than the democratic things. So that's a problem, but it's not a problem for us in GPA. It's a problem for people in comparative politics, but it is background. Since then, we have had this problem for the global political economy, lowercase, not us, we're uppercase, we're the scholars, because ever since the Bush and Gore period, only the US government has been in a position to have the means to establish some reform system of global governance that actually might do some things, at least it seems in our mind that way, and to be a leader, but the United States has had absolutely no interest in doing it. And again, to go back to Falk's point, this is something that is not something that started with Trump, It's something that started with Clinton. Okay, I think I'm done. Whoa!
Fantastic. Under time.
I told you I'd do it in 6 minutes.
All right. So just curious, before we move to the next panelist, Randy, did you have any
So yeah,
comments, reflections that came up?
two just observations. One was the first statement that we coherent system of global governance is impossible without a global hegemonic power.
No, I don't think it's impossible, but we don't know how to do it.
We don't know how to do
And
it.
our
I'll give it better.
field of
Okay.
GPE or IPE, here I guess it's IP, that's not something that we've spent a good deal of time
So,
investigating, although
okay.
we spent a good deal of time investigating a lot of other things. that kind of snap.
So one observation for me is the connection then between illiberalism or autocratic nationalism, as you kind of put it, and the continuation or decline of that hegemonic power. I just, to me, that's an interesting connection.
It is a
I wonder
connection.
how
I don't know what it is.
How we go on that one?
Okay.
And the other one really, I guess, is about the connection then between illiberalism and nationalism. To me, that's, I have a comment to make on that in my remark as well, and that to me seems to be absolutely appropriate.
Are there any quick comments or quick questions that were from the audience that we want to take before we move on to the next panelist? Nobody wants to take it.
Right.
All right. Okay. In that case, we will move on to Jacqueline Best, for 6 to 8 minutes.
Okay. Well, I'm going to suggest that it's useful to look, I'm going to go kind of theoretical, I don't know why, that's just where my head is at. So I think it's useful to look at these moments where we see the rise of liberalism, not necessarily in opposition to kind of pure liberalism, liberalism versus illiberalism, nor simply as the internal logic of neoliberal capitalism, which some people have done interesting work on. But I'm going to suggest instead it's useful to see it as a rather extreme expression of some of the internal tensions in liberalism itself, or more specifically, in liberal democracy. And I think that there are various ways that liberal democracy operates through a series of constitutive tensions that require moments of exception or moments of illiberalism. Kind of, we usually see illiberalism light here and there, and maybe we're seeing illiberalism heavy, but I think we have to think of them in relation to each other. Now that might sound like, what am I talking about? I think it's more familiar in the security context, or looking at another connection we have. Both Randall and I were students way back when of Rob Walker's, right? So Rob does this. That is, in the security context, we know that universal liberal norms and values, like human rights and so on, must exist within the context of a specific state. That's how we think of it today. But at the same time, that creates a whole range of tensions in which some, in that sense, they are never fully universal. There are always some who are included and some who are excluded, sometimes absolutely at the border, and sometimes in forms of gradation, and so on. And we also see there are moments where those rights are in fact suspended. We accept them or we challenge that, but they're suspended in the context of war or the threat of war. And obviously there was a lot of discussion after 9/11. I think that that literature has some really important insights into some of the paradoxes, some of the constitutive tensions in liberal democracy, but I think there's also a second set of tensions that are more, that are the tensions of, or political economic tensions. And I think the principal one here, and here there's some really interesting links with what we just heard here, which is tensions between the free market and kind of democratic stability. And that is, I think, the free market is obviously fundamental to a liberal conception of rights. And rights and freedoms. The liberal market is often, free trade is seen as a solution to some of the problems of conflict and therefore a way of resolving some of those tensions. But of course, the free market is massively unstable, crisis prone, and tends to produce massive inequality, all of which put it into tension potentially and, well, in many cases with democracy. That's one of the reasons why the gold standard, worked reasonably well in the 19th century when there were basically there was no democracy. It became more of a problem once people had the capacity to say, hey, we don't like, massive recessions and depressions, we're going to mobilize. So there's another tension. And the way that often gets, the sort of little moments of suspension operate by sometimes constraining market freedoms for the sake of democracy, but increasingly by constraining democracy for the sake of the market. And here we see some links with what Craig was talking about. So that is, I think, this broader framework I'm interested in. And I think, why is that useful today? Well, I think maybe, and this is just me throwing out ideas at the moment, but I think maybe we got into this current mess partly through the strategies that we've used to resolve these tensions in the past. But I think the neoliberal solution can be massively oversimplified as, on the one hand, global economic integration, and on the other hand, technocracy. Okay, so global economic integration, globalization, becomes a way of mitigating some of those tensions that occur between universal liberal values and the exclusions that are required to have them exist within particular states with hard borders. But of course, the effects of that, as we've seen, of forms of economic integration have been to actually re-articulate, reproduce many of those divisions and exclusions in different forms, forms of north and south, rich and poor, degrees of access, and so on, that we see through logics of inequality. And so those inside-outside dynamics I talked about before are not just those of the state and the outside, right? Those logics of inside and outside, of inclusion and exclusion, operate at many, many kinds of levels, in fact. There's a lot of good literature in political security studies that talks about that. So that's global economic integration. On the other hand, we have technocracy, right? And that, I think, has been the solution to the problems of markets' political instability. And that, I think, we've seen the response, in particular, I think this is particularly clear when you see the response to each successive financial crisis since the 1980s, has been to radically constrain democracy in various ways. And again, there's a big literature on this. By pushing off the table a whole range of political problems, by saying we can fix this partly by insulating monetary policy, by taking these things off the agenda, and therefore, though, not talking about the political costs of the decisions and the kinds of inequalities that are being produced.
Insulating trade.
Yes, trade, intellectual property, a whole range of things that become increasingly not subject to debate and conversation, and then politics becomes management, and you don't have a real democratic conversation. Okay, so if those were the neoliberal solutions, then I think the re-emergent right can be understood partly as one of the many things they're doing is exploiting some of these residual tensions. And I can't talk about, I think there are interesting parallels with what Thatcher and Reagan did in the late 70s and early 80s. I don't have time, but if people want to ask me, I'll talk about that because some of my research is on that. But I would argue that in some ways, so what are they doing? They're partly responding to a perceived decline of the state, right, in the face of economic integration, by fetishizing a concept of the state or of us, of the inside, that is a performance. And again, we can understand that the stateness of that is always mobile and being constructed partly by producing in relation to a sense of those are outside. And those that are outside within and those that are outside the borders. But they're doing so in a way that's increasingly depending on these increasingly violent logics of exclusion within as well as without. They're doing so partly by mobilizing a particular kind of fear of the other, from migration, race, and nationalism, that is both domestic and international, okay, it operates at both those levels. But, and this is why I think IPE is important, they're also doing so, I would argue, by weaponizing a particular logic of economic individualism, okay? By appealing to their base as isolated individuals in a rigged economic system who are frustrated in their inability to achieve their economic dreams, and then mobilizing, and therefore because of these others, next to you and outside. And the narrative here is that the market is rigged, but the solution is the market, right? The solution is not to redefine a conception of the economy that is social again, but again, it's still in the sense that the solution is the market. So, for me then, what does it mean for IPE? Then I think we need to understand these dynamics by linking through, by making IPE look at some of these dynamics that we see in IR theory and critical security studies, but also by getting the critical security studies people to get on board and recognize the economic logic of so much of these dynamics. And that's why I don't think these are mutually exclusive. I think that we can understand these dynamics by bringing these conversations together.
Excellent, thanks, Jackie. We have Juliet.
1 minute.
Pose a quick response if
Okay.
anything comes to mind.
Sure. 3 quick things. First of all, I think you're absolutely right about the need to have the security IPE dialogue. It's always shocked me that doesn't exist, or what's there is very fragmentary. And I think it's one of the reasons that we relate to recognize a lot of these phenomena, because the right people weren't talking to each other. Second, in the your point about technocracy and this respect and over-reliance on expertise earlier on, and certainly you see this with central bank, where of course they've been pushed to do more and more and more, until even the central bankers are kicking back against it. It's like, no, we actually don't want this much power. We can't do this much. Governments, these are questions that you need to answer, not us. Of course, in doing so, they also are disavowing any responsibility for the inequalities that their monetary policies, even in their very traditional form create, but that's another issue. But then what's come out of this in this reaction against it is a decline in respect for expertise of all kinds. I mean, this is the kind of dirty aspects of populism that especially bothers university professors, right? Nobody cares what we think anymore. In fact, not only do they not care what we and subject experts think, but there's an inherent suspicion of any kind of expertise that I think is really damaging. And this gets me to my last point. So we talk about how, and I think you're right, that these that these illiberal notions are an expression of the internal tensions in liberal democracy. But at what point do the contradictions continue to mount such that the system can't be maintained anymore? I mean, is this a system that can be self-balancing in some way, or in fact are we going to see a new paradigm emerge?
So we can either put those comments on the table, or if you want to respond.
No, I'm happy
okay.
to just have them on the
So
great
we'll
questions.
we'll come back to
We're
some of
going
these
to
issues.
talk about this stuff.
Any quick responses, comments from the audience before we move on to the next panelist? You're welcome to jump in.
They want to hear.
They want to
all
hear,
the
all
things,
right,
like the
fine.
cactus.
Okay. So next up we have Randy, and after Randy's presentation, Jackie has a chance to talk.
Okay, so I'm going to have three sets of observations and reflections, a kind of a micro one, a kind of a personal one, a macro one, which has not been spoken about yet, a personal one which keys off of one of Jackie's points, and kind of a micro one which I think keys off of one of Craig's points. The big one, though, for me is the observation about the relationship between illiberalism, it's not a word that comes off my tongue, I have to say, illiberalism and globalization. You know, our entire discipline has been built around trying to figure out what is up with globalization, why, you know, what drives it, blah, blah, blah. And I think the re-emergence of illiberalism casts a kind of a very interesting light on that. There has been a secular trend, no matter how far back you want to go, towards greater global economic integration of the world's economy. And you know, one aspect of this you know, relates to really the relationship between openness and economic exchange and global integration. And I think in this context we have really nailed down as central for our analysis the relationship between liberalization and globalization. So the question then is, when this goes into reverse, will we continue to see growing openness? Will that secular trend continue? And I don't know. I think for me the really interesting question will be, to what extent can we have an open but illiberal global political economy? And for this, I would just take us back to about 30 plus years to what I think is a very fascinating article published by one Susan Strange called Protectionism in World Politics, where she pointed out that the rise then of protectionism is actually not the death knell to an open economy. Because why? Because for her, the drivers of whatever globalization was, and she often called it globaloni, really was to do with corporate decisions and with a whole host of things that had only tangential or random connections to free trade agreements and whatnot. And I kind of, for me, that's interesting. A couple of years from now, are we going to see, my bet is, global economic integration will continue, international economic exchange will grow, and we will have a liberalism amongst a very significant, important number of constituent units. So I think we can see that globalization will proceed without liberalization. And to me, that's going to be an interesting puzzle for the discipline that I claim to be a part of. So that's kind of the macro one. The personal reaction and reflection on illiberalism really keys off of one of Jackie's points. And it's really, we have a binary here. And I'm wondering, to what extent does the growing recognition of whatever it is illiberalism is, to what extent does that prompt us to reevaluate neoliberalism? For those of us who would consider ourselves progressive or on the left or whatever it is, Neoliberalism has been the bogeyman, or the bogey person, if I want to be gender neutral, right? Yeah, exactly. You know, everything that is wrong with the world is about neoliberalism. Well, all of a sudden, we have its opposite. And I'm kind of, you know, I mean, I think that makes a lot of us uncomfortable. And so how to navigate this binary, which I think is exactly what Jackie's talking about, whether you think about it as inside, outside, or whatever, is, to me, a really interesting question. And you know, as a follow-on, I kind of wonder, why is it that we think in terms of binaries all the time? So, you know, I think that liberalism and neoliberalism is making a lot of our settled ethical and moral judgments about the world, is calling them into question. One part of me kind of likes that. Another part of me is very worried about that. So the third set of comments really, I think, keys off of where Craig left us. And for me, it's the relationship between illiberalism and either politics or, if you want to be more specific, democratic institutions. I've always been puzzled by the seeming equation between modernity and liberalism, in the same way that I've often been puzzled by the seeming equation between democracy and liberalism. And I think it's very interesting that the rise of illiberalism is most profound in democracies, but past forward democracies, whether it's, I'm not going to reuse the T word, but whether it's in, you know, America or Britain or, you know, a number of Central European countries. So the question is, can illiberalism be democratic? Can it be a logical, legitimate expression of democracy? And then, of course, that connects to participation in economic life, in the market economy, and it also connects in my thinking with a word that I thought Craig would use, because he used it a lot yesterday but didn't, which is citizenship, right? And so to the extent that a particular conception of citizenship, the weaponization that Jackie's talking about, also in a way, you know, is the predicate for our participation in something approaching a market economy. I think illiberalism and the rise of illiberalism, for me, really opens that up. And I guess I'll end by just saying that thinking about illiberalism as a you know, expression of democracy, which can have an impact on our conception of citizenship and how we can participate in many things, including economic life, really, you know, makes me wonder why it is that democratic institutions seem to have a tendency, or maybe they are more susceptible to these kinds of pressures. And you know, that kind of makes me uncomfortable, and I don't have any answers to it. But it also tells me that, exactly as kind of where Jackie ended and where Juliet you know, commented, that this relationship, this negotiation that we usually identify as political between either us and them, or slightly, you know, between technocracy and expertise, and the impacts on everyday political life, is something that in IPE we have to make much more central to our research agendas.
Okay, thanks. Anything?
Two quick points. One, just on the binary thing, I totally agree. And actually, oddly enough, I don't know if it's going anywhere with this potential project with some of the folks at Sheffield, Colin Hay and others, are thinking about a project on post-neoliberalism, right? So if you want to just keep adding the acronyms, of course, there's a discussion about that, and literature on that next on Latin America about, like, you know, in a critical, constructive sense, but also it's got the darker side too, and thinking about those relationships. So let's just keep adding to that. No, more seriously though, this question of liberalism and democracy, one of the things that I find, of course, there are illiberal democracies. Are we moving down that direction? Very likely. But at the same time, and I had to teach this first year politics course, which I had a blast doing this last year. And one of the things that, you know, I was going back and reading, you know, again, rereading, teaching like Weber and Schumpeter and stuff, right? Like, and they saw the solution. They were very worried about mass democracy, right? Coming out of the Second World War and fascism. Their solution was technocracy. Maybe that wasn't actually the best solution, right? So I think, to me, it's really interesting seeing how, you know, we respond to one set of strategies, and then, but in the end, that seals off, and, you know, in some ways that some of that dissent and so on goes underground, comes up in other forms. You don't provide a space for it, and you end up in trouble once again.
Hey, thanks. So since the audience has foregone their opportunity to speak up to the panelists, we're going to go in, finish our panelists, and then we'll open up to discussion. So our final panelist is Juliet Johnson, and then responding. Great.
All right, great, thanks. And this is the one occasion on which I can say with full absence of guilt that I wrote this presentation on the train on the way up here, since I was only just asked to do it yesterday. So what I'm doing is, so I actually might use my 8 minutes, because if you have less time to put something together, you tend to talk more than you should. But I will do my best to make it as pithy as I can. And when I was thinking about the questions that were raised here, the first thing I thought about is this essay that the Ripe editors put together in 2013 on the future of IPE. We were trying to think about how to conceptualize IPE and where it should go in light of the lessons of the global financial crisis. And in there we're talking about our, again, rediscovery that the global economy is one of uncertainty rather than risk, like we can't really plan. There's this historical contingency to economic relationships. There's actually no such thing as an equilibrium, all of these wonderful things, and that what we should really do is focus on what we called, in that essay, a pragmatic IPE, which is, and here I'm quoting ourselves, marked by a focus on real-world problems rather than on theory for its own sake, a rejection of any separation of politics from the economy, an awareness that local and global developments can't be analyzed in isolation from each other, and in consequence an acknowledgement of the complexity of the world. All right, great, the world is complex. What does that mean? How do you operationalize that? Yes, thank you, the world is complex. Well, what I want to talk about, what I want to say about that in this particular context is to discuss what I've called this post-crisis financial nationalism, the rise of financial nationalism, and the need to break down divisions between IPE and CPE in order to understand it. So in terms of IPE, we've talked a lot about financial statecraft, and there's this really great essay by Leslie Armijo and Sayori Katada on this in New Political Economy fairly recently. They've got a book on this. So this is the use of monetary and financial tools to achieve foreign policy goals, currency manipulation, sanctions, dollar hegemony, that sort of thing. And then if we look at what CPE has been doing, that's about kind of developmentalism and protectionism, looking inwards in response to crisis. So individual states rejecting the global liberal order and trying to focus on domestic priorities, needs, resulting in a liberalism, and there's tons of work on this, especially on the ways in which this has been happening in EU states. So what I want to say is that we need to examine these phenomena in dialogue with each other more systematically. And again, one of the ways I'm doing that is through trying to develop the concept of financial nationalism, which is basically an approach to a state's monetary sector that promotes financial sovereignty and in the name of the nation, explicitly in the name of the nation. So it overtly conflates financial activism and national patriotism. So in doing so, it's this umbrella concept that has both an internal and an external dimension. And internally, the foundational concept is one of monetary sovereignty. So you want to ensure that domestic currency predominates in transactions on your country's territory. And you also want to favor national financial institutions over those run by outsiders, however you're defining outsiders in your particular polity. So this approach can take a lot of forms. It can take things like governments seeking political influence over their central banks, which makes a lot of sense from a financial nationalist perspective, and we're seeing some of that. And also favoring insiders over outsiders in ownership and regulation in commercial banking. Those are the kinds of ways it works at home, but then you need to tie that to the way it extends beyond a country's borders. And external financial nationalism, I would argue, is actually broader than financial statecraft, because some countries that engage in it actually have the objective of reshaping and even replacing the global financial order. And so if you look at what some of the BRICS states have tried to do in terms of promoting alternative currencies for international transactions, to create different international institutions, some of these efforts have been more successful than others, but it's really a more ambitious program than I think the idea simply of financial statecraft might suggest. And then if you buy this idea that financial nationalism is at least one way to think about bridging the internal and the external in the post-global financial crisis world, you'd want to ask, does this represent a potential paradigm shift, or one potential shift, right? And particularly in what like Mark Bly and Matthias Matisse have called the monetary policy paradigm. I don't know if any of you have seen that great piece they did in Perspectives on Politics. I think it's in the most recent issue. But you know, they're talking about how the global financial crisis led to the breakdown of this international paradigm that was based on central bank independence, low interest rates, low inflation, financial globalization, wage suppression. They talk about it as an organic system. So you know, first there was Keynesianism, then there was this paradigm. Now it's broken down. They actually don't talk about the replacement. They talk about a general populism trend, but where does it go? But what I do want to say is that if you look at financial nationalism, and especially in that way, these kinds of policies have achieved some kind of success so far, right? These policies have avoided some mistakes of traditional economic nationalist approaches. You know, they don't have inherent implications for industrial policy, trade regulations. They don't contain pressures to spend yourself into a debt crisis, right? There are actually internal pressures not to overspend because you can't maintain monetary sovereignty if you are a profligate state. And it's not just a rejection of financial openness, which I agree with Randy, it doesn't make sense to think about that as an option in today's world. Instead, it's strategic deployment of that openness for the benefit of the nation. So for example, you might allow foreign minority ownership of financial institutions. You might promote bond sales in domestic currency rather than foreign currency, a lot of those sorts of things. And, you know, and so one of the last things I want to say about this is international finance is actually a crucial factor that makes this financial nationalism possible. It works because of financial globalization in a pretty ironic way. You know, countries that want to pursue it, you know, need to have access to trade, access to international bond markets, you know, access to these sorts of resources. But they want to have that kind of access on their own terms. So then the last component that arguably makes this possible gets exactly at what Randy was talking about. Can you do this sort of thing without, you know, in the democratic context? And I would actually argue that ultimately you can't do that very well, that it doesn't work, and it's primarily because of what you need to do with your domestic economic institutions to make these kinds of policies happen. The amount of control you need to have is one that does not sit very well with politically open institutions. And so then I guess the broader question for all of this, again, if you buy my argument in the first place, is to what extent this is exportable and sustainable. And I have some thoughts about that, but I totally used up my time, so I'm not going to.
You're right on the money, 8 minutes. So excellent, thank you. So Craig.
So one major reaction, which is that financial nationalism or financial versus financial internationalism or financial openness, having a policy on one side or the other doesn't necessarily tell you where a state is going to be relative to other dimensions of the international political economy. The great protectors of the world, the open market right now, happen to be some of our BRICS, who are trying to also create a...
Oh, absolutely.
And it's not only doesn't it tell you where you are relative to trade, which is actually kind of important stuff, it doesn't tell you, as you already said, where you are relative to investment policy in your own country and elsewhere. It doesn't tell you where you are relative to intellectual property policy either, because there are different versions. Nobody's even sure what an open intellectual property policy is. The current one, our neoliberal intellectual property policy, is basically one that says let's protect a certain group of companies that are mostly from Western Europe and the United States, and allow them to make money on their intellectual property. A truly more internationalist policy might be some of the things that actually China's pushing right now, but which is, and it doesn't tell you anything about your policy towards standards. Oh God,
It's true.
and like one of the great issues at the moment, nobody probably around the table except Tim and Jane have probably heard me say this before too often, like one of the big decisions that's going to be happening soon is whether China decides to become like Germany relative to standards policy, or whether China decides to become, its alternative is to become like the United States. And the United States has never been actually very good on international standards, shall we say, for a variety of reasons. So it's just a simple statement. I think you're right on about what you're saying, but it's also important to recognize in terms of there are other dimensions of internationalism, liberalism and illiberalism, nationalism and internationalism in international policy, and they don't go together necessarily, and they never have.
I agree.
Okay, well, thank you guys. Thanks to all the panelists for, there are so many different directions we can go in here. And well, maybe the best thing to do now is to turn it over and get a couple comments, questions, and we can either direct it to a specific panelist or to the panel at large. And for the sake of getting to know each other, if you don't mind introducing yourself, that would be useful as well. We'll take three comments. Let's start.
I'm Jane Harper, and I've managed to become an adjunct professor at both Carleton and University of Ottawa. And it's nice to be able to be home at both of them. I want to add a layer here. I'm doing a lot of work on silence, gender, and power in insecure sites, and I'm looking at the way in which gender operates with a lens going down into looking at the individuals rather than staying up at this high level of abstraction. And I've been very influenced by the work of Christine Sylvester on emotions, where she points out that war, you can't understand the experience of war without understanding the way the embodied experiences of people ground up in conflicts. And the same kind of work is emerging from the feminist political economists, who are arguing again that it's the big picture that you've all painted is really crucial, but they're also real people attached to it. And for instance, to understand what's going on in Trumpland, to the south of us. I unfortunately am an American as well as but I think we have to understand the embodied individual experiences of these white workers who grew up thinking because they're white, at least they're white, which gives them some privilege and some leverage, and they've been losing that field. And because they're the competition, so at an individual level, a lot of people are experiencing security and insecurity, both economically and in terms of safety, at different levels. And then if you bring that together with the post-colonial literature, because I didn't hear anything about the different ways that these institutions, these global institutions, impact on cultures with different histories and with their own struggles, and trying to also create their own sense of identity that's somehow not just written onto them by the big global institutions that are mainly based in the North. So that's just, I'm just throwing that into the discussion.
Okay, thank you.
I'm sure I'm also pleased to be adjunct on both campuses. I just want to push Craig a little bit in terms of both the role of FANG, Facebook, etc., in terms of keeping their version of neoliberalism alive, but then also the Chinese version back, so Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent, and the degree to which we should or shouldn't place our faith in emerging multinationals as opposed to old or less emerging multinationals in terms of multilateralism and globalism.
Thanks, Tim. Is there another question we can take or comment from the panel? Okay.
I guess I have two. The first one builds on, I think, the previous questions, and relates to how do you define hegemony? Like, does it have to be a state? Can it be an idea? So are you looking at, which definition would you have a globalization without? Can you have it without the fundamental idea, or can you have it without the fundamental state? Just sort of exploring that. And then the other question is talking about financial nationalism. What about I'd be interested in your comments on the role of the United States in 1944 in establishing the American dollar as what is now the global currency. Is that, like, how do you see that in here?
Okay, so maybe what we'll do is go through the panel and offer each of you a chance to respond to any and all or none of them. Any comments, questions?
I think I respond to both of you, but I would not respond to Jane right now a little bit. I think that there is a debate among business leaders and government leaders in China right now, which in one sense is a debate about whether one should be trying to think of China as becoming a state leader of a networked form of global governance that would be pushing, in fact, an extension of neoliberalism, a version of neoliberalism that will be emphasizing free trade more than anything else, but in a slightly different financial world than we currently have. Or there's an alternative idea that's really popular in China right now, at least among some business people, which we haven't talked about at all around the table. There's this weird thing that came out of the World Economic Forum immediately after the financial crisis, was this notion of establishing global governance via stakeholder standardization. That was the global redesign initiative that basically said we're going to follow the kind of ISO model of creating voluntary standards that anybody can adopt. The Kochs love them. Voluntary standards that anybody can adopt through stakeholder meetings that will kind of over-represent stakeholders that happen to be large companies, but global companies. And that's a very popular idea in many parts of the world, and it's a very popular idea in places other than programs in international political economy or global political economy where we don't discuss it. It would be the hegemony of an idea of governance that differs significantly from the kinds of ideas of governance that we have now. I think some people are starting to begin to find ways to think about these things intelligently, but they are very, very different views. And one of the places where our friends are, if we're going to have the relationship between our friends in Silicon Valley and our friends in China, is that that's a question that both sides are actually still talking about. It's like, do we really want to have this thing that is focused on national governments, except as national governments, everybody recognizes, as an important consumer of products. We know that they're very large consumers, and therefore should sit at the table as large consumers should always sit at the table. But isn't governance better done by the really important expert actors who are the most important stakeholders, which are obviously the large companies?
I'm just going to respond to Jane. I think it's an excellent point, and I know Mike. So mine was a perspective from 10,000 feet. I'm actually very interested in, like, a lot of my work right now is on inflation, which I think is incredibly abstract, right? It's about rules and credibility, but actually, if you look at, I'm looking historically at different efforts to manage it, but it's visceral. It's about fear. Yeah. It's about, or it's a confidence. Credibility is ultimately based on legitimacy. That's based on a set of lived social experiences and practices, and to really understand it, you have to dig down in some sense. And so I think that becomes really interesting when you see the ways in which things that seem very abstract actually rest on a set of lived experiences. On the specific point of, in this context here, to me, part of what's so interesting is asking, so, getting back to this idea of the weaponization of economic individualism. It's like that isn't the only way you could tell the story right now, right? It's not the only way you could feel that experience. You have this experience of being excluded. It does not then have to translate into xenophobic racism, it can get translated in other kinds of ways. It could
Chauvinistic
get,
and mean-spirited.
yeah, it could get translated into
Non-chauvinistic.
a radical critique of the market, and it isn't, right? So that's also to me very interesting how instead it shifts. And again, for me, I don't have an answer to this yet, but the echo to me that seems very interesting. I've been looking a little bit at the 70s and the ways in which the conservatives in Britain worked to reframe the whole conversation about what unemployment was about and how the and what the role of unions were. And they actually worked very hard to kind of desocialize that experience of being an economic citizen and to make it into a me versus you instead of an us together. And they really, and I don't know, that I've only mostly read speeches and so on, so we'll see how much that actually played out. But there was an attempt to certainly tackle, and even explicitly to say, Keynes seems to say this, but really, and again, to really challenge people's sense, so that again, people understood themselves as, their sense of what the problem was, what the solution was, became very different. They were attacking a moment where there was a kind of a sense of the social. We're in a moment now where I think there's much less of that, but it's interesting that the logic is still one, and that's again gets me to Randall's point, like, it's the right, but it isn't, I don't think we're past neoliberalism in any real sense, right? But also we're not in the same old one either, we're somewhere in between. But you look at the new right combined things in radically new kinds of ways, right? So none of this none of it's pure, all of it is messy, and it's understanding how these different tensions get pulled out and manipulated, I guess, or, intensified.
Well, one way to address the part of your first question about the people who've been brought up to say, well, at least we're white, but we don't, is redistribution. If there have been strong redistribution, but that has been systematically eroded. So, and I think that's really one of the failings of the way in which, over the past 40, 50 years, the relationship between citizens, the state, and the economy has kind of been framed. But the real question I want to offer a response to is Elizabeth's question about so what constitutes hegemony or hegemonic authority, and a part of me, and I'll just put this on the table and then I want to answer it, but a part of me, because I'm of a certain age and becoming curmudgeonly, retreats to a fairly materialist definition of that. And what I am over and over increasingly struck by is the way in which, apropos Juliet's comments, some of Juliet's comments, the way in which the dollar, the American dollar, and American capital have served to anchor the fundamental limits of how the global economy is organized. And I see no way around that. I see no challenge to the dollar and its role as the world's global currency, and what all of the privileges that represents, all of the leeway that cuts, not only the American government, if they chose to act on it, but more importantly, rich Americans, American financiers, and American corporations. And I think the structure of the global capital market reinforces that. So to my mind, there is a material anchor to how the world's political authority is at least enabled, although not exercised. I don't see how to get around that. And so that leaves me in a very awkward and uncomfortable place. But it also tells me, or at least it gives me a reason to understand why whatever it is we're talking about today actually originates in the United States. In the same way, Karl Polanyi, we must find the origins of market economy in 17th century Britain. That's where I think that's where illiberalism is a global problem because of the global implications of how American political economy is organized. And then I don't even know if there's any particular agency for that. It just leaves me feeling very queasy. That's why I'm going to leave that.
That's terribly depressing, and I'm going to agree with it all. Okay, so there are two things I want to say. First to Jane. So I appreciate everything that you've said. You're absolutely right. what I want to push back a bit on one aspect of what he said, though. That so you talked absolutely correctly about how people experience security and insecurity in different ways, how this matters. And then you say, well, we have to look at we have to really look at the experience of the white working class in this sense. That's one example, but I mean maybe this is just a reaction I have because I feel like we've paid so much attention to Trump voters, and there are a huge strata of society. Yeah, we're going to agree on all this in the U.S. and around the world who've experienced much deeper levels of insecurity for a much longer time than this particular group. So I'm not sure why we should try to understand them, I suppose, but we shouldn't privilege them in doing so. But second, the modal Trump voter is not white working class. The modal Trump voter is somebody like my, racist, misogynistic stepfather who, goes to the country club with his golf buddies and talks about, how immigrants and feminists and, the rest of us are ruining the world and forwards me like offensive things as he pulls off weird websites. And the modal Trump voter has a higher annual income than the modal Clinton voter. And okay, good. I see this has sparked a lot of debate. Okay, before we get into all of that, because this will be fun, then I want to talk about the dollar. And first of all, agree with what Randy said. And in part, I want to kind of rehabilitate this concept of financial nationalism, because if we think about the way the term has been used in the past, it's been used in this kind of normative, pejorative, not very analytic way, and it's talked about, oh, this is a reactionary policy that losers take. And the winner
like
takes the
Alexander
vote.
Hamilton was one of those losers.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. That's the thing. It's not just for losers. Everybody can engage in this, but it's going to take different forms depending on where a particular country is and what its structural position is. And here, to get to the U.S. dollar example, I mean, one could argue, I have to think about if I want to do this, but one could argue that in the past era, the only financial nationalist actor was the U.S. And you could call that, right? And so because the U.S. had the power to structure the rest of the world around its very specific national interests, and now the concept is simply being democratized in a sense, perhaps. I don't know. I'm curious if you all think I should go there. I feel like it could be interesting, but I don't know if I should. And I agree with Randy that now that the system has been established, this dollar hegemony, there is not a substitute for it. It can be chipped away on the edges, but I don't see the replacement either. And so yeah, in that sense, there are some inherent limits to how much change we can see in the system.
Okay, I did see, before we turn to another round, I did see a response both by Craig and Rita. Did you want to jump in?
No, I will just ask the question
Yeah.
or comment
Okay.
or something like that.
Okay, in that case, we'll...
So just a quick thing about the sort of modal Trump voter. One of the things I was trying to say in my 6 minutes was an argument that is an exaggerated argument that Richard Falk makes, but I think there's some truth in it, where he says, really the American political system has become a situation where the two major political parties, or anybody who's trying to come from the two political parties, really is trying to create a coalition between Wall Street and whatever Wall Street wants. And he has to do that because of the way the financing system for the elections work. And some minimum group of voters who can be snookered enough to think that they have been, they're going to benefit from the way things are. And Falk's kind of argument is that Bill Clinton and to some extent Barack Obama essentially snookered a group of Americans who are from minority groups, etc., around the country, snookered elite women, snookered the group that is the Democratic coalition. But if you actually look at what they offered as policy, they offered Reaganism light, right? Just like Blair offered Thatcher-like. In fact, very, very light. In terms of social welfare provisions, Obama and Clinton did a really good job of tearing things apart. I mean, yes, Obama did get the United States to now have a sort of weird healthcare system that's better than what it was before, and that's probably a big deal. But they had their particular coalition of people who were snookered by, in order to have a coalition that essentially supports Wall Street. And this is a different coalition. It happens to be a coalition of people that are like my relatives in the country clubs in Wichita and never mind. Well, but it's
We know these guys.
we know these people quite well, but also people who are truly suffering in ways as Jane's talking. I mean, that's also real too. But I think Falk's exaggeration, there's some truth in it, that the problem is that the political system doesn't give the possibility of creating a coalition either of the right that would elect a Hitler who would transform the economy in a way that people were well off, which he did in his peculiar way, or Roosevelt who also was able to transform the economy in a way that actually that isn't on the way the American political system works anyway. That's
And it only did that once.
what's that?
It only did that once.
You elect a Roosevelt?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah, in the war.
well, Truman and Eisenhower were actually kind of like Roosevelt in a lot of ways. So.
All right. So once again, we've taken the discussion into even further in more directions. So Rita, did you want to?
Yes, thank you. My name is Rita Abrahamson. I'm a professor in the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs and also the director of STIPS. Thank you, first of all. That was absolutely great. I have had a wonderful time, so thank you. My question stroke comment, but it's a question I think, follows from various things that you've all said, and it's a question about ideas, I think, because you've talked a lot about the material and finances and money and redistribution as a possible solutions to the rise of illiberalism, the rise of nationalism, populism, and so forth. But then there's also this underlying sense that there's something dirty about these white people who are still white and excluded, and we don't really like their populism, right? But if as scholars and responsible intellectuals we're going to cope with the rise of illiberalism and populism, we're going to have a way of talking about this. We're going to have an ideology or a set of ideas that can include them, that will work for them, that will make them, if we still believe in democracy, vote for us, right? And I'm wondering if from IPE and your own perspectives there's something we can learn about how we win back these excluded majorities and sometimes excluded minorities that are not, that is not simply rooted in material issues like redistribution, but at the level of ideas and collective living.
So question back.
Yeah, I do have a question. So I really like to talk about the nationalism of finance, and I would ask, I'm a finance student at Carleton and I have a degree in politics. I would ask further, what about credit monitoring agencies and credit rating agencies? Would the national roots of those organizations also have some implications for liberalism? And secondly, more going off of what Dr. Murphy said, which is that for example, Clinton and Trump, one and the same to a degree. And my question would be thereby, is there a role of which the media can, and in a positive way, grassroots media, can really shift the nature of the dialogue and perhaps allow for a new entrant, or what would a new entrant really look like into the American politics?
Okay. Any other questions?
I'm going to ask an impossible question as a start and then put a real point on it. And the question is, if the panelists could talk very, very briefly about what they think illiberalism is. And the point I want to put on it is that I actually think that academics are structurally incapable of understanding it. I think we are congenitally, by our actual position in the social and cultural field, incapable of understanding exactly what is going on now. And we want to shove it back into a set of categories that make us feel comfortable, that reinforce our positions about where we stand and where other people are to be put. And as a consequence, we simply systematically are incapable of constructing it in any way outside of our own categories. And it seems to me that one of the most interesting manifestations of this is the way in which, I would argue, the kind of populist economics that Jackie was talking about are really found on the far right. There's a really good article, I can't remember the woman's name, in last week's Nation magazine, on how the far right is in fact the best left-wing economics in America right now. This is also true in all over Europe. This is true in Austria. This is true in France. This is true in the Netherlands. This is true almost everywhere you want. If you want to see a real running left-wing economics, look to the right. Don't look to the left. This is not neoliberalism writ large again. This is a whole different set of categories. It's a whole different set of ways of working with it. And it knows who its enemies are, and we are part of it. And one of the reasons that we are part of its enemies is precisely because we can't understand it, and it understands us. And it hates us, right? And it is not simply the lower working class. It is also the people you're talking about, right? And to come back to Jane's point, it is an emotive appeal. We are part of a liberal elite that literally doesn't understand the world from this perspective. And I think we have a huge challenge to wrap our heads around this, precisely because our world is structured in such a way that we are systematically reinforced in our incapability of understanding it, and indeed, to some extent, even talking about it, right? Because the structures of contemporary academic life are such, and the strictures of contemporary academic life are such, that these are dirty words and dirty people. We all know that. We all have to put scare quotes around them. We all have to adopt certain tones in our voice when we talk about them. Of course we do. They understand this. This is why they despise us, because they know we despise them. So what we're looking at here is not simply an economic, someone argued. It's a political economy, and in this sense, it's a deeply cultural economy. And we are part of the problem, not part of the solution so far.
Great questions, and our last two people asked questions didn't fully introduce yourself, so if you don't
Sorry,
mind.
Michael Williams from the graduate school.
Okay, thank you. All right, well, there you go, guys. We're part of the problem. Yeah, well, why don't we start with Juliet this time?
Because I'm part of the problem.
Your uncle.
Institution. You're from a elite institution. We're just colloquial
Oh,
institutions.
They're from up the river.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's funny. I think about this in terms of my own positionality because, okay, my stepfather belongs to this brother and all, but I personally grew up in a very precarious economic situation, and my dad ran bars and wasn't very good at it, and all of these sorts of things. And I have a giant family, and I'm the only person who's ever done anything like this. So I get actually really annoyed also when people talk about, the ivory tower, the little elite doesn't understand, this other group of people. It's like, actually, I feel like a lot of us do understand both. Because we've had experiences in both worlds. We come from both worlds. Well, they're not just both. There's more than two. And if there's any bubble, it's the bubble of a lot of people, many of whom I'm related to, who don't look beyond their own very narrow experiences. So in that sense, are we part of the problem because we think it's a problem that they have that point of view? Totally. Yeah. How do we deal with it? How do we, getting to your question, how do we include everybody if we're serious about democracy? if we're serious about inclusion, which we should be, how do we find a set of ideas that is going to appeal to, you can't appeal to everyone, there's nothing that will allow that, but how do you bridge these kinds of divides? It's a really good question. I don't truly know the answer, and I think a big part of the problem is that at least again in the part of the world I study the most, the post-communist world, the left has completely discredited itself. The left, not just when they were communist, but since then, when it has been the leftist parties that are actually kind of pushing austerity programs and participating in the system, where it's been the right-wing parties that are saying, no, this doesn't make sense for us. And so I think, to the extent that that's not just a phenomenon in the area of the world that I know as much, but a more global one, I think it's, I think the problem is not even so much the message, but the messenger. The left around the world has lost credibility in talking about these issues, and so it's ceded ground to, it's ceded ground to really extremist right-wing movements. How does the left regain that? This probably does require, different people, not just different ideas, but different people to be spreading this message. And how we achieve that and where they come from and all that, I don't know, but it's true. It's probably not from here. And on a much smaller and easier to answer question about credit monitoring.
Where do you go?
Yeah, this is actually quite interesting because, because in a sense, we know that they're completely in bed with the countries and the companies wherever that they rate, that it's creating this kind of fictional economy, but. And what some countries have done, and Russia is one of them, is actually created its own national credit rating agency, and I think you're going to see more things like that. The Russian government said, well, we don't like the way the international rating agencies have treated us. We're gonna create a national one, and they did, and the results haven't been maybe exactly what they expected. There's many shares I could talk about.
There's actually a standardization committee now, an ISO standardization committee on creating national credit standards board. So it's like different place in the global government.
So there's an international standard to create
national
standards.
standards
For credit rating.
This
is exactly what I'm talking about.
No, it is. I mean, it's exactly that. I mean, it's exactly what.
Okay. I need to know more about this.
All right, so Randy?
So, yeah, but, that's all nice, but, so I'll key off of the credit rating agencies. The credit rating agencies are part and parcel of the global operation of the market economy. I mean, they take information, they provide information, which then gets used, and so becomes instantiated within, the foundations of a market economy. So the question is this market economy going to be organized as it has been over the past 50 years, even possibly 60, on a global basis, or are we going, are there going to be initiatives which begin to hive off components and organized nationally? So this is to me, and this is where I started, this relation between the open liberalism and open economy globalization. I'm not sure that's tenable. I'm not sure you can have capitalism on a national basis. You can have national economies, right, which can be linked in certain surface exchange ways with one another, but can you have a genuine, as I would understand a capitalist economy to operate, on anything other than a global basis? I would direct us, I think Fred Bloch still wrote one of the best books on, which indirectly address this question, the international origins of, the international origins of economic disorder, where basically, and he really took us through the debates in the United States at the end of World War II, which could have actually organized the American economy on a capitalist basis, but nationally. And it was American corporations, American capitalists, which effectively put the kibosh to that. They must have a global scale to give them freedom of operation to accumulate and save and spend their capital. Okay, so financial nationalism, I think, has the same kind of built-in tensions of scale that I think really will generate some kind of fundamental crisis. So this is where I think illiberalism becomes interesting, because if, and circle back to Rita's question, but if in fact the right has the answer, which ultimately is a form of economic nationalism, has to be because it's based upon insiders and outsiders. Okay, right? That has its limits, and this is Bloch's argument. But the problem with the national capitalism, if you're confining your capital to the national borders, and you're actually growing your economy, you're generating distributional conflict. So the way to provide the best form or the best terrain to engage in that distributional conflict is to make it as global as possible, to maximize your opportunities as the owners of capital. I don't see any way around that. That's the materialist part. Now, that's how do I sleep at night? Okay, so part of me, I said no. Well, we're all good. Part of me then is, Rita's posed the question. So what is, you use the words ideas, I could also use the word language. What is the language we can use to negotiate this? I don't have the definitive answer, but it strikes me that the language that we can use has to have a slightly different conception of citizenship, of insiders and outsiders, of who can participate, who cannot. And then, this is the one kind of kernel of virtue in the idea of global capitalism. And we all have our labor to sell, and it's a wide. Okay, so that there's a particular kind of freedom there. You hide that off with very impermeable borders, and that freedom becomes so sharp that it's going to be reduced. So I think that, to me, that is a recipe ultimately for a much stronger form of authoritarianism. So the language, the ideas have to be about refashioning that, and that's just really difficult. Why is that? Because, I opened by saying there's been a secular trend towards openness and globalization. There's also been a secular trend towards a growing state. I think they go hand in hand, right? But they're not free of tensions. And so, I don't really want to be in a one-state world, I think, unless I'm on the right side of it. But
China would be in charge.
well, I don't know. I don't know about that, right? Because we still have the dollar, right? We still have America. We still have global accumulation, and the final point here is that China's accumulation dynamic has to be earned. A chunk of the accumulation that occurs in the United States is not earned. It's captured. All right. And this is where it links to intellectual property. And I don't know about the rest of you. I refuse to give Apple money. And I refuse. I do Google searches, but you are all part of the problem on that one. I know, but not anymore.
Microsoft is
So. Wow.
Yeah, same strategy, and they actually were the ones who perfected it long before.
I'm done.
All right, now that you've outed all Jackie?
Oh my lord, I don't know where to go with this. I got point. So one answer, what is liberalism? I don't know.
Illiberalism.
Illiberalism, I don't know. But that's the easy answer. But my answer to these things often is like, so far as I'm trying to make sense of that, is to go historical. Like that's often mine. Try to unpack like how these things have teased their way out over time. Because I find often I can't be someone else, right? In the sense I can't have a different lived experience. But what I do find is reading historically is fascinating, that like you get a sense at least of how things felt and were lived completely differently, not that long ago. Even just looking at like inflation policy in the 60s and 70s, it was all about incomes policy. It was messy and political, and it was about negotiating with unions and trying to put controls on prices and massively expanding bureaucracy. It's fascinating, completely different. You can't even imagine that that would be the, you know, so again, even just these little ways, going back and just thinking about what was the norm and how actually we moved quite rapidly in our conception. So it's, yeah, the policies, the materiality is different, but the lived experience is also very different too. Question, second quick answer, no, academics should not be answering. What should we be doing? I mean, I figured this out when I was like 16, and I read 1984, and I realized actually we should be writing novels. Like, really? We should be writing novels. Unfortunately, I'm not that good a writer, but if you actually want to change people's minds, and these days I think people are still reading them. I mean, you need a novel that's going to be turned into a Netflix series, but you know, that's the solution now. But no, but really, and I teach novels now in my first year class, because like you really do get that you also need to operate at a different level, and then you speak also to the visceral, to the affective. You mobilize things. So basically, yes, we're all not doing. I mean, you know, what we're doing has some use, but at the end, I think we should be writing novels.
Please not.
Although probably not us writing novels. Other people should be writing novels, having been inspired by our brilliant academic articles. Yes. Okay, that's what
Academics writing novels is 1984.
on this issue of the economics of, like, so there's a long history of excellent critiques of capitalism coming from the right, you know, and the production of functional alternatives like fascism. Unfortunately, so I would see that as a left wing. I mean, I think that, you know, the difference is about levels of, you know, like that ultimately a left wing critique is still fundamentally about what emancipation or, you know, challenges to exploitation. I mean, there are some bases we can say where there might be some points in which we might be agreeing in the critique but not in the response. And I don't know enough about other contexts, for example, like in the areas that you look at, Juliet, but my sense is that Brexit and Trump are not, that's not what's going on there. I mean, that is, instead what I think is, you know, it's a critique to some extent of some elements of this kind of economic technocracy and global economic integration, but it's one that is still pulling on liberalism. That's why, you know, financial liberalism, nationalism is still consistent with this. It's still ultimately operating within a liberal economic framework, and it's also speaking and it's mobilizing its base on that same base, and doing that interesting hybrid, these coalitions you were talking to, where that is still the common language. The economic sense of self in that is still, the economic sense of citizenship is still fundamentally this, you know, capitalist sense of the individual. The neoliberal that is about, you know, entrepreneur of the self and so on. Is still there. But then, and Rita, I think, for some reason it made me think of two things. One, way back when I made a PhD proposal, for a shirk proposal that I never actually acted on, because there are no shirk police, and so I did this as a PhD student, I went to something else. But I wanted to look at the ways in which, historically, a genealogy of security that would see security itself as being fundamentally economic as well as political. And I actually wanted to link it to gender, but I can't remember now how, but it's too bad, because I think that would be, I have to go back and try to find it. But, you know, but the sense of what it means to be secure, and secure at a very fundamental level, is that those two things are always intimately connected. And that when politicians go in and mobilize that, you know, fear and weaponize it or whatever, right? There's some kind of interesting combination of the two that's being, and that we need to be attentive to that. I mean, I think Conley's done some stuff with that, you know, with his capitalism resonance, the fundamental capitalist resonance machine, but thinking through some of those relations. The other thing that just jumped in mind is I read something recently that talked about how there's some interesting work on, you know, how maybe some of the causes of depression are about people's sense of meaninglessness and powerlessness, which is often linked to experience in the workplace. You know, and classic critiques coming from the left were about democratizing the workplace, which is about a radically different conception of democracy, which is about giving people, we have horrible bureaucracy, but still we have a lot of control over our lives as academics. Maybe that's why we don't get some of these responses and critiques, but like thinking at that fundamental level. So anyway, that's a bunch of random responses to some great questions.
Final comments.
So I'll start with ideas that would sound like the ideas, and then explain why these don't work very well. But I still think they're the right ideas.
Okay.
So at the same time, I started out by saying, you know, I like Ottawa because my dad came here as a premature anti-fascist. And joined the RCAF. In the same month that my dad did that, Franklin Roosevelt I'm going to read some Franklin Roosevelt ideas and words and ways, words that could be used in media and except, he says, in the future days which we seek to make secure, we look forward to a world founded upon 4 essential human freedoms. The first is a freedom of speech and expression, long pause, everywhere in the world. The second is a freedom of every person to worship God in his own way. Really change that. In her own way, everywhere in the world. The third is the freedom from want, which translated into world terms means economic understandings which will secure to every nation a healthy peacetime life for its inhabitants everywhere in the world. The fourth is the freedom from fear, which translated into world terms means a worldwide reduction of armaments to such a point that, and in such a thorough fashion, that no nation will be in a position to commit any act of physical aggression against any neighbor anywhere in the world. This is no vision of a distant millennium. It is a definitive basis for a kind of world attainable in our own time and in our own generation. A kind of world that is the very antithesis of the so-called New Order, the tyranny which the dictators seek to create with their crash of a bomb. Now, the problem with this is that this is articulating a cosmopolitan global vision. It's an answer to the people who are feeling disaffected in whatever different ways with something that responds to what I think is, I agree with Randall, is a truth. That the kind of economy that we have now is, and that we cannot completely get rid of, is an economy that is increasingly and fundamentally global. And if it's going to be increasingly and fundamentally global, the response that is a response that can actually make sense to people in the places where they live is a response that talks about a compassionate world that is organized at that global level. Yeah, okay. Back to, I'm not going to give you a definition of neoliberalism because I don't care about that. But I do care exactly about what you're saying. And I, because of my own background, there is a way in which I probably have read more of the stuff on right-wing economics than you could probably possibly imagine. And heard it in extended family, etc. The flaw, and it's the same flaw that was actually the flaw in the economics of the Nazis, is that the kind of it is the flaw that you cannot organize a national economy that over time, and write footnotes, everything right at the beginning of modern IPE, you cannot organize a national economy that over time will actually continue to be able to provide the services, sense of dignity, sense of security, sense of being part of a responsible project, which in fact the Nazis and in fact Mussolini and in fact some of the people who are on the right writing across Europe and in the United States believe, and in some universities that we know about in the United States, believe that they are able to provide. You can eat as smart as some of those ideas are. It cannot be done over a long period of time. You have to go to the global level, and you have to go to the global level in a way that you're talking directly to the fears, concerns, emotions, and lived world of and back to Dick Falk, unfortunately, as much as I love the Clintons, and I actually really kind of like George H.W. Bush, I didn't know George W. Bush, that was something that they couldn't envision, they didn't want to envision, and didn't offer as an alternative. So if the United States matters in this, which unfortunately I think it might, the fact, it's not surprising, we shouldn't be surprised that the left is completely out of this, and it's also the case that most of us as academics don't think about that at all, but we should be capable of doing that.
Folks, on that note, I don't know about you, but I found this one of the most educational and entertaining events of the year. I want you to join me in thanking not only our panelists, but also yourselves for your contributions and your engagement.
Great format. It was very dynamic.
So we have another, well, we don't have to be out of here in the next, for another 10, 20 minutes, so if you want to chat privately, grab another sandwich. Go ahead.
If I have to.